We're in for a real treat tonight. Okay, we got an international Bible scholar in the house for you guys. This man has degrees from both Duke and Harvard. Okay, two schools that would take a miracle equivalent with parting the Red Sea for me to get into. Alright? This guy, people fly him around the world just to have him preach and teach at their church. So they can learn the Bible. And not only that, he's an extremely generous man. This is Douglas Jacoby right here. This is from his last trip to Israel a couple weeks ago. I remember I texted him last week and I said, hey, are you still good to come next week? He's like, yeah, I'm in my connecting flight from Istanbul. I'll see you in a little bit. And so that's just the life he lives. You know, it's a little different from you and I. But Doug is an extremely loving, generous man. He not only teaches the Bible well, but he puts into practice what he teaches. And he really lives a life that exemplifies the love and caring, compassion, and generosity of Jesus. He actually has a book that just came out. It's called A Quick Overview of the Bible. And so if you're reading the Bible, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing if you open up to like 2 Kings or like 2 Chronicles or Isaiah or something like that. Like, where is this in the Bible? Like, what are they talking about? And this is a book. It's just a resource. It's a tool that can really help you understand the overall narrative of the Scriptures. That there's actually a story from Genesis to Revelation and how it fits together. It's not going to be like give you every answer to every question you have, but it's a great tool to get started. And so normally it's actually $17. Doug is giving it to us for $10 tonight. And so if you're interested, which I'm sure you will be a lot more after his lesson, feel free to come up and he can help you if you want to pay for that. He has a card reader, all that kind of stuff. But it's a great resource. I have the older version, which has been helpful to me. And so we're going to hear from Doug tonight. He's actually doing a lesson on the book of Acts and Paul and his letters. And so understanding how the narrative of the New Testament fits in as we're reading Acts, which is when a lot of letters were being written. And so without further ado, I'm going to pray, and then Doug's going to come out and open up the Word with us tonight. So let's bow our heads. God, it's a blessing that we even have the Bible. And not only do we have the Bible, but we have brothers and sisters who can really help us understand it more. And can help us to grow in our knowledge, which will help us serve you more and more. And so I pray that we can open up our ears and open up our hearts to hear what Doug has to say tonight. And I really pray that you speak powerfully through him. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
Go, Doug.
Stepped on a rock. I don't remember that song from my days in campus ministry.
Hey.
And any of them. Is that a new one? That one really moves. Okay. I was hiding backstage. I didn't want you to see me trying to pretend I had any rhythms. I certainly don't. Very eager to share these things with you. Don't really need the pulpit. I use it for the first minute or so. Since I was last with you, which was 25th of January, I've been in Israel. Yes, it was the first time I was ever licked by a camel. That took place in Jericho. It was a fantastic trip. A really great trip, in fact. In fact, on the way back, the fellow I was flying with, we're getting together tomorrow. We are on the flight back from Istanbul to Atlanta. We had such great talks. He wants to get together, so you never know who you meet. What else has been going on since the last time here? We had our AIM session just a few days ago. A number of you came, and I appreciate that. Church history is cool. And then what else? Yeah, China's the next thing. And I've got another 14 cities, 7 countries. It's a pretty busy year. Graham's already mentioned this book. I don't know how we're going to do this. I just want you guys to pass it around so you can see it. If you can do that in an orderly way, you have to figure out the way. It'll probably take, no, you've got to look at it. You've got to open it up and look at it. Makes it to the back of the room within, say, half an hour or so. That's totally cool. Or even 45. So, wow. I was asked to speak on this topic of the life and letters of Paul. And I'll do just that. Let's go on to the next. You know, Jesus and Paul are quite, by far, I'd say, the people we know the most about. Jesus because we experience him as we try to walk with him, and because we have especially those 4 Gospels, though it's not the only part of the Bible that shows us Jesus. But Paul has something even Jesus didn't have, in that Jesus didn't write. I mean, he may have written, but I mean, he didn't write something that ended up being preserved in the Bible. Whereas with Paul, we read about him in Acts especially, but we also read things that he's written. And that enables us to triangulate, and I think to really get to know the man much better than we would otherwise. In fact, you could argue that apart from Jesus, Paul is the person in the Bible that we know the best, if we're willing to do the work. Now, there is this kind of interaction between what's going on with Acts and the letters, because Paul writes 13 letters that end up in the Bible. And then in Acts, we read about his conversion and then almost 30 years of his life. But how they work together, how they fit together is not always obvious. You know, there are 89 chapters in the Gospels. Paul's letter is 87. Paul wrote 1/4 of the New Testament. His friend and traveling companion Luke wrote 1/4 of the New Testament. Luke was the only Gentile. Everyone else was Jewish. Those two wrote half of the New Testament. And so understanding what Luke, who's very careful when he talks about places and times and events, understanding his relationship with Paul, how that all worked out, is pretty important stuff. So I want to share a few different things about Paul, a bit of background, and then we'll actually be talking about every one of his letters, and at the end we'll have some time for questions. But someone can let me know when we get to, say, the 14-minute mark. Could someone do that?
14.
Okay, just give me a signal. We must be at least 3 through right now. What you're looking at here is a picture I took in a cave in Ephesus. Ephesus is the most extensive and most impressive biblical site in the world. In some ways, even more than Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem is a mixture of modern buildings and the ancient. But Ephesus is all ancient. And there's a cave called the Cave of Paul, where we see a picture of him. And this picture very much matches the description of Paul in a 2nd century document. And what did they say he looked like? He wasn't super tall. His legs bent out just a little bit. Maybe there was a disease. I don't think it was from riding a horse, but he was a little bit like that. He had a hooked nose. Most important, he was bald. Even though he didn't wear glasses, he was bald, which is a tremendous honor in the ancient world. I'm just kidding. Just say that for me, really. But this is the picture of Paul. So when I went into that cave, I thought, yeah, that actually fits really well. Let's keep going. We don't really know for sure what he looked like, and that's not important. But it would be interesting if you meet him in heaven one day and you recognize him from the picture from this evening, this Tuesday Night Live. He said, yeah, I saw you before. Paul, a Roman citizen and a Pharisee. Most Jews were not Roman citizens. That was a tremendous honor. He also was not from Israel. He wasn't from Palestine. Where was Paul from? You say Tarsus, but then I might ask you, where's Tarsus? Do you know? But you've heard of the phrase Saul of Tarsus. Shaul was his Hebrew name. Now, when he got his more Greek name, Paulos, that was a good shift. Because Saulos, which is the way you would probably bring it over, kind of means, it means someone who's a little bit promiscuous, or man maybe who's quite effeminate. It's just not a good word in Greek. Whereas Paulus is perfectly good. So he gets that name as a citizen, but Tarsus is in Anatolia, what today we call Turkey. I've never been there, but I go to Turkey every few years, and I will go there at some point, because the ruins of the city are impressive. He was thus brought up outside, but also outside Israel, but also he trained under one of the most famous teachers of Israel, whose name was Gamaliel. His grandfather Hillel was really famous. This is the background even to the New Testament. The people who followed Hillel were a little bit more liberal, a little bit more gracious. There was another school, the school of a rabbi named Shammai. And Shammai was very hard line. They had very strict rules. Hillel was the easygoing guy. And Paul was trained by Hillel. By Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel. So I don't know if you've ever even heard of him, but I promise you, if you had lived in the first century in Israel, just dropping that name would have been a big deal. So he's a Roman citizen, and he was trained by Gamaliel. That's like saying, yeah, I went to Oxford and I went to Cambridge. That's quite a combination. So he has this, I guess he could have reasons for tremendous confidence, but it's clear he doesn't get his confidence in that way. He's born a Roman citizen, he's trained as a Pharisee, and he comments on his own life in Galatians 1. He says, I was advancing way beyond what my contemporaries were doing. I don't think he's boasting. He just was a very driven man. And part of that drive led him to persecute the Christians. So it's not something to be proud of. In fact, when the first Christian martyr was executed, who's standing there watching their clothes? They take off their outer garments. I guess so they won't get blood splattered on it. But they take their garments off, or make it easier to throw rocks, one or the other. And I used to think, they just said, here, young man, here, look after our cloaks for us. I don't think that's it. I think it's more like he was organizing it. There's a good chance Paul was the one who was in charge of that execution. Of course, I'm referring to the execution in Acts 7 and the very beginning of Acts 8. So he's trained. He's quite an incredible guy. And as a Pharisee, he was in a great position to explore that relationship between the old and the new. Judaism and Christianity. If the Bible, meaning the Old Testament, because that's all they had, right? If that's God's word, well, what about the temple and the priesthood and the sacrifices? And how does that tie in today? And people from that background, do they have to live that way? Do non-Jews have to live that way? Do they have to follow the food laws? Do they have to get circumcised? Right? Visit to the doctor before they can become Christians? And these were hot issues in the first century. In fact, that was the number one issue in the first century. And I think Paul, because he'd been trained and he thought through these things, he's in quite a different class to the other apostles. I don't think any of the other ones had that kind of formal training. Now, they had great training. They were trained by Jesus for 3 years, and a practical internship, which I know included learning a lot of Bible. I can tell that from the way these guys spoke after. But Paul's was different. He had extra training, and that's important. In fact, a lot of his letters are very much centered on that issue. If those are God's people, then what now? Does God have like two peoples? Christians and the Jews? Or is one the extension of the other? Are two covenants in operation or just one? Well, just one, Paul said. But this dominates the book of Romans. It's probably why he wrote Romans. It's vital, very clear also in the book of Galatians, where Paul goes ballistic at the thought that anyone would add anything to. I learned you got to do this with two hands, or it will be a disaster.
Come on, Doug.
What else? Ephesians is very much about God making the church out of, it's like two people. It's like the Gentile and the Jew. Colossians deals with misunderstandings surrounding this. So does Philippians. Now, I know you may have heard some things about Philippians 3. He talks about people whose God is their stomach and glory is their shame. God is their stomach. I think he's talking about Jews who are troubling the church, is saying you have to be a Jew to be a Christian. And he says, no, it's not about the stomach. Glory in the shame. That's about circumcision. In both Testaments, shame normally refers to the genitals. It's a euphemism. He's talking about people who take great pride in things like circumcision, and he's saying, that doesn't count. Look, if it counted, I would be thrilled because of my pedigree, because of my learning. And he shares about that in Philippians 3. But in fact, it's nothing compared to knowing Christ. Colossians, Titus. It's all over the place. All right, the third thing I wanted to mention briefly, and if you want a passage, it would be Matthew 19, or easier to remember, 1 Corinthians 7:7. Paul had the gift of celibacy. That is, he was single as far as we know. And he didn't marry. Now, marriage is the kind of the normal route in society, but it's not for everybody. I'm not saying that, being a playboy or playgirl is an acceptable alternative. No. The alternative to marriage is permanent celibacy. And both Jesus and Paul say, if you can do it, it's better than marriage. That's not me, that's the Bible. Don't let anyone pressure you into getting married. Maybe that's not for you. Maybe you want to be like Paul and Jesus and have more flexibility. And there are reasons for that. So we're looking at a man who is very much at home in the Gentile world, the Greco-Roman world. Being brought up in a Greek city in Anatolia, he would have spoken Greek. He wrote in Greek. The whole New Testament's in Greek. The Old Testament, that nearly all the Jews used, is also in Greek. Would he have spoken Latin? Maybe. That's the Romans' language, but most of the Romans spoke Greek at this time. He was clearly familiar with their literature. We see how he quotes from the Greek poets and playwrights, philosophers. We see that when he sharing his faith in Athens. We see it when he writes to Titus on the island of Crete and other places. So it's a guy who is very much at home in the Gentile world. Let me add some other things. He's sincere. He's tough. He's resilient. I mean, have you ever looked at the list of things the poor guy went through in 2 Corinthians 11? I mean, in 2 Corinthians, he's defending what's he defending? His apostleship. People are saying he's not really a first-class apostle. In 1 Corinthians, people were making fun of him for not being a polished speaker. I imagine he was an effective speaker, but he didn't have the polish that some people wanted him to have, because there were certain conventions. And his point, and really throughout 2 Corinthians, is that these other guys, and they had actually called themselves super apostles. Great, you just add the word super before whatever you do. He said they're relying on prestige and letters of recommendation. And for them, there's this, they're so close to God. They take stock in ecstatic experiences. Paul said, look, I had an ecstatic experience. I went to the third heaven. But I'm not going to tell you about that. So that's not a mark of spirituality. What is the mark of spirituality? Paul says, I'm sorry, you're driving me to boast. What does he boast about? All the ways he's suffered and been oppressed and been disrespected. Not looking for pity. Not looking for pity, just saying, I've been shipwrecked a number of times. I've been stoned with stones. I've been... It's just a long list. Yeah. So he argues there that the real mark of spirituality is not degrees, accolades, having an incredible resume, having a certain heritage, or going to a certain school. The mark of spirituality is suffering. Because the closer you follow Jesus, the more you will be honored with that opportunity to suffer. Well, his life is amazing. And he was a hard worker, and so he's incredibly effective. We read in 1 Corinthians 15, 9 and 10, I am the least of the apostles. There's some humility. He is the least, and he was the last. I don't even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by God's grace, I am what I am. His grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I. The grace of God that was with me. Too often when I hear people tell me that they really appreciate the grace of God, what they're saying is, I just rest in God's grace. I just float through life. It's like they're looking for a comfortable life, a guilt-free life. That's not understanding grace. Paul says, who understands grace? It's a guy who works hard. Now, okay, I'm not talking about someone who's working out his mommy issues by throwing his life into something that consumes his time and his health. I'm not talking about that. But don't say, I really have a great understanding of God's grace if you're not a hard worker. That's nonsensical. And that applies not just to your Christian mission, but your work in school and anywhere else. The response of the human soul to grace, if we really understand it, is dedication, is application. But this guy, unimpressive in appearance, 2 Corinthians 10:10. Not a polished speaker, 1 Corinthians 1:2, or 2:1. But he was someone who related to people, and he tried hard to relate to all people. Let's keep going. Now, if we want to understand how the letters and Acts work together, let's very briefly talk about the book of Acts, and then we'll talk about how they fit together, because I think as Christians we should be able to explain the story without getting confused. You can do that. Okay, in Acts, Paul is presiding over the execution of Stephen, and what chapter is that? Yeah, both. And what happens in Acts 9? Paul's on the way to Damascus. There's a gate in Jerusalem called the Damascus Gate. It's probably about where the road went to Damascus. And he's going there to round up Christians. Damascus is one of the cities in the Decapolis. It's also the capital of Syria. As I read today, ISIS is occupying less than 1 square mile right now. I mean, have they been totally routed yet? They'll pop up again somehow. On this tour we just had, we went up on a hill on one of the days when we were in the Galilee, went over to Golan Heights, and the guy said, look over there, that's Syria right there. And some days they can hear the guns or see the rockets, but not that day, for which I was quite happy anyway. Happy to see Syria from a distance. What are we talking about? Book of Acts. So Acts 9 he's on the way to Damascus, and Jesus stops him, and he becomes a Christian soon after getting to Damascus, probably a couple days later. Now, who tells his conversion story there? It's the author, it's Luke. Paul is on trial in chapter 22. He tells the story. It's a different story. Not a contradictory story, just a different story. And then he shares a third time about it in Acts 26. So 3 times he shares what he did. After his conversion in Acts 9, he immediately begins to preach. He doesn't wait. Immediately. He had a lot of background, and he just had the miracle of receiving his sight back, and he had seen Jesus, and so I probably wouldn't want to wait either. I don't want to misuse the passage to say, if you were baptized yesterday, you better be preaching to whole cities tomorrow. But Paul was on the fast track for sure. We read about him, we read less and less about Peter, more and more about Paul. And 30 years later, Paul's in Rome. He'll get out of prison in Rome and live a few more years for a bit more ministry. But he writes his letters from cities mentioned in the book of Acts. And we can often figure out the chronology and exactly what's going on. Okay, everyone exhale or inhale or stretch. I'll give you 10 seconds to do that. It's good, there's a lot of numbers coming up. Okay, now let's look here. Born in Tarsus. Now why would we say 1 BC? I think, in part, when we get to Philemon, there he describes himself as an old man. There's a pretty broad consensus that Philemon was written in the year 60. So if he was born in the year 1 BC, how old would he be in the year 60? Don't answer too quickly.
61.
He'd be 60, because there's no year 0. There's no year 0. That was an oversight for sure. When that monk, Dennis the Short, came up with a system, he didn't have a year 0. Okay, so he's born there. He's trained by Gamaliel. And I'm assuming, this chart assumes he's baptized in 32. The latest would be 34, based on Galatians 2:1. Because Galatians 2:1, he talks about a visit to Jerusalem 14 years before. And the church's start date is almost certainly in the year 30. So it's not hard to work it out. So if he's baptized, we're just saying in the middle of that period, Let's say he's baptized in 32. Damascus, he goes to Arabia, probably to Petra, the capital of the nearby Nabatean Arabian kingdom. Petra is the place in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's that place in the desert that has pillars. It's an incredible place to see. Hope you get to see it sometime. So he's there. He has further revelations. He visits Jerusalem. He spends time with Peter and John and Jesus' brother. And they realize they're all on the same page, which is good. He ministers more. He visits Jerusalem again. All these things make sense. If you're afraid, you can take a picture of it and remember, but I have another way. He gets back to Antioch, and then from Antioch, which, if this was the Mediterranean, okay, Turkey, Anatolia would be up there, Egypt is here, Israel is here, Antioch and Syria would be right here. And that becomes kind of the base for missions. So for world missions, the base is not Jerusalem, it's Antioch. And in that first missionary journey, they go first to the island of Cyprus. And there, I think because of family members of Sergius Paulus, this Roman official who becomes a Christian, Sergius Paulus, archaeologists tell us, had relatives up there in Turkey, in Anatolia, and so that's where he goes next. So the missionary journey, it's like they have a destination, but they keep adjusting the course. Missionary journey, that's called the first missionary journey. Now, sometime before the Jerusalem Council, he writes Galatians. Well, why did I say that? Because in Jerusalem Council, which is the only council of the church that we read about in the Bible, what is the hot issue? I've already told you. It was the number one issue in the first century, which was, how Jewish do you need to be? All right. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you're circumcised, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. I mean, no kidding. Because Paul understood circumcision to be part of the old covenant, not the new. And it's not just getting circumcised. If you get circumcised, then you're supposed to obey the entire law. You probably can't do that anyway. And so that's why the council meets. Peter presents, Paul shares his experiences, and then Jesus' brother, who's presiding over the conference, sums up, end up writing a letter. But in Galatians, because the issue is, he says, I'm astonished that you're so quickly abandoning the one who called you, the grace of the one who called you. You're turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel. But if we or an angel from heaven should come and preach unto you a different gospel, what does he say? Let us be anathema. Let us be condemned. So what's going on, and you read it all throughout Galatians, it's a very strict, very strong letter. People are trying to say, to be saved, you need to obey the Jewish law, or else they're saying, to be all you can be as a Christian, you also need to follow the law. These guys, I think they were saying Jesus is the way to salvation, but they were adding something. Either binding it on people or making people feel you're second rate unless you act more Jewish. Like Passover and Pentecost and things like that. And Paul says, we don't add anything. And if the council had already met, the reasoning goes, he would have just said, look, we had this council last week. Here's the letter that was drafted that Silas and I delivered. You don't have to do this. He doesn't even refer to the council. And the easiest explanation is that it hadn't taken place yet. And that would push Galatians to the year 48, making it the first of Paul's letters. Yes, sir. Oh, let's get going. Too slow. Now, it's possible that James is earlier. Jesus' brother, also Jesus' brother Jude wrote a letter. They might be older than 48. I think they're probably in the 40s or 50s. But tonight, we're talking about Paul. So, that's the first one, Jerusalem Council. Then let's go to the next slide for the other dates. By the way, you may have noticed, he went to Arabia, and we don't really know what happened there, but I think it was like a spiritual retreat. I think it was something like that. He was getting his head together. I'm going to have one of those later this year in the Canadian Rockies in October. My head's already kind of coming off my nut. I think it'll definitely need some adjustment. But for you guys going to a student retreat, what an opportunity. When I went, it took me about 24 hours. In the middle of the retreat, I realized, wow, I'm not even a Christian. I need to be more humble and stop getting attitudes when everyone doesn't call me brother. I was trying to sing those songs. It was hard to keep up, especially There Is Beyond the Azure Blue. What kind of lyrics are they? They weren't simple like that thing about the rock, stepping on the rock. Okay, so he returns in Acts 14 from the end of the first missionary journey. He gathers the church together, they share the good news, and that's the end of the first missionary journey. If you have a Bible at the back, it'll have a map, it'll show you the route. It's not hard to figure out. Then, in the second missionary journey, it starts soon after the council finishes. He goes to a number of different places. You can see the chapters up to chapter 18. So he's in Philippi, chapter 16, which is a really cool place to visit, I promise you. Acts 17, he's in Athens, he's in Thessalonica, he's in Berea. In Acts 18, he's in Corinth, among other places. Now, how can I say he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians from Corinth? The key is actually in 1 Thessalonians. Because so often you'll be reading a letter and he'll tell you where he was when he was writing it. We'll talk about the purpose of this letter a little bit later on. But he writes the Thessalonian letters in 50, or maybe 2nd Thessalonians is early in the year 51, that's possible. There's a third missionary journey that starts near the end of Acts 18, right before they meet Apollos. And 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. You say, well, how do you know he wrote from Ephesus? Because when you go to Acts, it doesn't say, and then Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. You won't find that. No, you have to do some detective work a little bit differently. So I read in 1 Corinthians 16:8. I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a great door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many who oppose me. That would be my reason for not staying there. Many are opposing me. It must not be the Lord's time. He says, yeah, people are trying to stop me, and I think this can work. So he's in Ephesus when he writes that. And so he's in Ephesus, but we read about Ephesus in Acts 19. So while Paul is ministering in Ephesus, Acts 19, he writes 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians for Macedonia, which is like the top part of Greece. Although just a few days ago, they officially decided that Macedonia is going to be called North Macedonia, because there are two Macedonias. Maybe you've been following the story, I don't know. Then he writes Romans from Corinth. And we know that, again, they're verses that give it away. So you put these things together. So even though he keeps going forward to new places, he's always looking back to make sure people are doing well. There were only 3 ways to do that, 3 ways to follow up. One was to actually go back himself, which he does when he goes back to Corinth later on. Another way is to send someone you trust. Sometimes I meet places who want a Bible teacher, but I can't go. But I know someone else who can go. So I contact that fellow, and I say, here's the budget. Can you make it work? And they go, people I trust. Or you send a letter. And Paul wrote lots of letters. Do you have any idea how many? 39, because it's 3 times 13? That was a wild guess, right?
Yes.
39 was a pretty good guess, because it's a lot more than 13. In the New Testament, we see 13. But Paul went to dozens and dozens of places. How many letters did he write? How many letters have you written? I mean, how many letters would you write? Let's say if you had visited 40 cities and planted churches. Yeah, so I think Paul could have written 100 letters, 200. Where are they? Who took them out of the Bible? This is a total misunderstanding of what inspiration is. Inspiration has to do with their function. These are things that Paul wrote that God was using. He knew would be useful not only at that time, but later on. If new letters were discovered today, I doubt there'd be any new teaching at all. It would be more of the same. And so you say, well, of course, it'd be cool to find another letter, and it could happen. It's possible. But on the other hand, we don't need 2 books of Numbers and 4 books of Leviticus. You get the idea the first time. I'm in Leviticus right now, in fact. I'll start chapter 7. So what are we looking at? Oh, we're still looking at the letters. So he keeps going forward, but he keeps looking back to make sure people are okay, writes a letter, sends somebody trust, or sends somebody trust to carry the letter, or he returns himself. Because he's starting all these churches, most of them are in Turkey, Anatolia, but some are outside. We read about his imprisonment in Caesarea Maritima, which is a beautiful archaeological site. It's where Pontius Pilate lived. It was a beautiful city, and still is what's remained. And he's there for a couple years. Where's that? So I'm going to give you a little challenge. And I don't care how long you've been a Christian, because this is one you could work on whether you've only been a Christian a few months or just a few years. Get to know what's in every chapter of the New Testament. All 260 chapters. So I could say Philippians 3, Acts 25, Revelation 2, and you say, well, that's about this. Don't tell me you can't do it, because that's a lot easier than a lot of the coursework you're doing for your major.
Yeah.
Get to know what's in every single chapter of the New Testament. You can work on the Old Testament too. But I don't want to be overbearing. So what's going on? So Acts 24, he's in prison, and Felix is hoping for some graft. He's hoping for some bribe money, so Felix leaves him in prison beyond the statutory 2-year maximum without specifying charges law. And then the next guy comes in, Porcius Festus. So we know he's in Caesarea, or Caesarea, I want to be correct about it. And maybe he wrote some letters from there. Scholars are divided whether the prison epistles were written from Caesarea, or Rome, or possibly even Ephesus. So I can't be dogmatic, but this is the normal view. So he's in prison in Rome, and we see him under house arrest in Rome in Acts 28. And he writes Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians. So those are the prison letters. And you can tell they have a lot in common. He describes himself as a prisoner, just as he does in 2 Timothy. And Ephesians and Colossians are really similar. Colossians and Philemon fit together like hand and glove. Ephesians look like someone took Colossians and rewrote it, but kept a lot of the same wording. Read it closely, you'll see. He's released. Now, Acts 29 does not say Paul's released from prison, because there is no Acts 29. But for the ministry activity to take place that we read about in the Timothys and Titus, he had to have been released. Because none of those places fit places like the island of Crete. So he's released from prison. He writes 1 Timothy from Macedonia. He writes Titus from Nicopolis. And then his last letter, and he says, I'm soon going to die. That's 2 Timothy. And it makes sense that that was when he was rearrested in Rome. Now, the latest he could have died is 68, because he was martyred under Nero, and that's what Nero took. He could have been executed as early as 64, like Peter. But he definitely went back to Rome, and he was definitely executed. And as a Roman citizen, he would not have been crucified unless he had done something really bad. The penalty was decapitation, which I personally favor. That would be the way to go. Look, if you were captured and being executed, would you what? You'd rather peel off a layer of your skin once an hour, another layer? No, you want it to be fast. And chopping your head off with a sword is humane. Though there are archaeological evidence of how good the Romans were at this. Not that many crucified bodies have been found, but lots that were beheaded by Roman swords. And on average, it took the Roman more than one whack to get the head off. I don't remember what the number's like 1.7 or something. So quite a few needed more than one whack, and some needed 3. You get mad, this is going terribly wrong. I'm not commenting on capital punishment, that's a different issue. Only to say, you'd be very surprised at the position the early church took on that subject. But Paul didn't have a choice. He was going to be executed, and he was executed. Let's go on to the next one. Just in case you want to have them. The next one, here, all together. It's a little bit small. So we're talking about this a little bit more. Let's talk about his strategy, briefly. He concentrates on large cities. Jesus focused on little cities. Yes, Jesus went to Tyre and Sidon and Jerusalem, but most of Jesus' time was in little places. Paul didn't always go alone. In Athens, he starts the church solo. Normally, he went with friends. And if you doubt that, if you think he was like a lone wolf, read the beginning of Acts 20, and you'll see, no way. This guy's really connected. He loves to be with other people. Once a church is established, probably within a few months, Paul makes sure they have local leadership set up. Local leadership were the shepherds for that church. The Bible doesn't tell us how they appointed the shepherds, whether it was a vote or, I don't know, whether the church decided and the leaders ratified it, but the point was to make sure that these churches stood on their own feet. So they weren't like, oh, what do we do? Not that they didn't need connections with the apostles or those who had founded their church, but they needed to mature quickly. And so elders were appointed very quickly in the early church. That was another part of Paul's strategy. You'll see that in Acts 14, for example. His goal was not, in other words, to create a superstructure with him at the top. He was very light on structure. Another feature of Paul's approach was to go into fresh territory whenever possible. In Romans 15:19 and following, he says, I didn't want to take Christ to places that were already evangelized. And you could say that he's just being proud or he can't work with other people. I don't think that's it. I think it's because he really wanted to evangelize the whole world. And if you guys are doing it, I don't need to be there. I can go to a fresh place. And one of the places that he was most interested in going to was Spain. And he went to Spain for what reason? Well, because Christ wasn't planted there, and he writes Romans to raise money for his trip to Spain. Well, the letters are fascinating. The last thing I'd like to do, before we have time for questions, is just speak about the purpose of these various letters. Because if you know the purpose, you'll read it the right way. We tend to read the Bible skimming and looking for a good verse, something that puts something well. And if it doesn't put it well, then we get another translation and we try to find something that's worded well. That is not the way to do it. What we need to do is study well until we really understand. So his earliest letter, I've already mentioned the purpose of that, Galatians. It was so that this topic, this Jew-Gentile controversy, would not rip the church in two. 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes, he says, because some people are saying Jesus will be coming back any day, and so why do we need to work? And Paul says, keep your job. Keep working. Do something useful. Don't bring reproach on the gospel. In 2 Thessalonians is something quite similar, but there you've got people saying, well, maybe the day of the Lord has already come, and he's correcting misunderstandings that came up with 1 Thessalonians. 1 Corinthians is written to answer a list of questions that they had, which he deals with starting in 7:1 all the way to 16. And he also, in 1 Corinthians, responds to things he heard from the brothers who had just come to him. And what they're concerned about is disunity. And some people saying, I follow Cephas, others say I follow Apollos, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. So it's very much about unity and that sectarian spirit in the church. And he humbles them by preaching Christ crucified. 2 Corinthians, we've already mentioned, there's a challenge to Paul's authority, and Paul defends himself not by boasting about his qualifications, it's by instead sharing about all of his weaknesses. And Romans was written, as mentioned, to prevent disunity over this hot topic, Jew-Gentile controversy, to prevent that from dividing the church. Plus, he wanted money for Spain. The prison letters, Philippians, is about unity. And the congregation had, I think, stopped being as unified as they used to be, and he emphasizes service, taking the examples of Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Jesus. Colossians argues that Christ alone is supreme and sufficient. You don't need astrology, you don't need philosophy, you don't need to go back to Judaism, you don't need extra rules outside the Bible. Philemon is a Christian who had a servant who ran away to Rome, where he became a Christian thanks to Paul, and Paul is sending him back and is looking for Philemon's release. Not just to be set free, but for reconciliation and unity, so that everyone feels good. Ephesians, we've mentioned. There were people pressuring Gentiles to act more Jewishly. And then last, the pastoral letters. 1 Timothy warns about false teachers in Ephesus. 1 Timothy is written to Ephesus. And Paul had said in Acts 20, some of you elders will end up becoming false teachers. Not just some of you, or outsiders will sneak in. No, it'll be from your own number, it'll be some of your own leaders. Woo. Titus, again, they're false teachers from what's called the Circumcision Party, which is a group or a sect, not a Saturday night event. We're saying you have to be circumcised to be saved. And he wants to really deal with this because these guys are going house to house and destroying the house churches. And part of this, Paul says, we need to get eldership. We need to get the elders appointed. And finally, 2 Timothy calls people to persevere to the end, just as he has. He's about to die. So unlike the case of Jesus, with Paul we have double sources to understand his life and message. Under the influence of the Holy Spirit, Paul was really writing for us, for posterity. His words, preserved and studied in our time, are still life-giving. They're like the words of his master. They're inspired and practical for our daily lives. The understanding I would like you to have is how Paul's life in Acts and the letters connect with him and the churches that he started. And you can do that. It may seem daunting. It's not. The Bible's not that long a book. The New Testament is certainly quite short. And you can definitely do this. Next. Oh, we already talked about his philosophy. Keep going. Background information, that's helpful. Keep going. Letters, we went through already. Keep going. And the book. And if you're interested, tomorrow it'll be 17, but tonight it's 10. Chapter 21 has everything I said in this class and quite a bit more. So see me if you like a copy. And before the question time, does anyone have a birthday today? Nobody has a birthday today, that's fine. Zero? Nobody? Physical birthday? No? Okay, anyone tomorrow? If it's not tomorrow, I give up.
Yesterday.
Who has a birthday tomorrow?
Yesterday.
No, tomorrow is the day after tomorrow. No one tomorrow? All right, then we reverse thrusters to yesterday. Anyone else? Only one? Okay, so I've got a copy of my latest book for you, which is When God is Silent, The Problem of Human Suffering. You can grab it right after. All right, we have time for some questions about Paul. And I don't know how you want to do this, Cody, Graham, you guys, but we'll figure it out, won't we? My question is, does it make sense?
I'll help you out there.
You help me out? What I presented tonight, does it make sense? Paul plants churches, writes letters. A lot of this is in Acts, some of it's not. Okay.
Hey, just raise your hand, and I know half of you, so I'll say your name out loud. So, any questions for Doug? Don't be intimidated. All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody.
It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. No, I'm just kidding. That's Steven.
Hi. So, can you tell me some applications of knowing information about Paul?
Applications for knowing this information about Paul?
Yeah.
One application is that when you're using the New Testament, like the letters of Paul, you'll be using those passages correctly, rather than just guessing what they mean based on very light and common sense. Because the problem is we just read a verse, and if you don't connect it with his ministry and his overall approach, it's very easy to make the Bible say whatever we want it to make it say. This can help us make fewer mistakes. It's also going to help you better answer other people's questions. Because most people know very little about the Bible. I know we're in a neighborhood Bible study, and some of the people who come, they know nothing. I mean, you can even tell them, the Gospels or the New Testament, but that's not helpful because I don't even know what the New Testament is. You're going to be able to answer people's questions better and better the more rooted you are in the Word. And also, since Paul is following Jesus, and in 1 Corinthians 11:1, he says, follow my example as I follow Christ. If you can imitate Paul in that passage, it's imitate how he's willing to give up his rights, and you'll be following closer to Jesus. That's 3 applications right there.
Doug, could you tell us the relation between Paul and the other apostles, whether they were some more close than others, or if they kept it correspondence with each other?
The relationship between Paul and the other apostles.
Yeah.
Paul made it clear he honored their work, but he wanted to preach where Christ wasn't known. So he has those 2 visits to Jerusalem, and then there's a 3rd visit, which is the Council of Jerusalem. So he meets them at times like that, and his main purpose was to make sure we're unified. And one of the concerns that those guys had in Jerusalem about Paul as a new apostle, are you going to really care about the poor? In Galatians, Paul says that was the very thing I was eager to do. So it's not a lot of time. If there was a significant amount of time, it would have been before, as he was persecuting the apostles, so that maybe doesn't count. And at the end, when he's in Rome, and Peter's in Rome, there's strong historical sources saying they were both executed under Nero. So it's quite possible that they were together, or even working together in Rome. But apart from that, there was a certain distance, because the Mediterranean's a big area for 13 guys. You were there on Saturday, so it was in this week's newsletter, or was last week's newsletter. This week's is tomorrow, right? Where did the 13 apostles go? Where did they actually travel around the Mediterranean? If you get a hold of that, look at it, you'll see. That could be helpful. So good, honest. Look, Paul's respectful even towards those who preach Christ with bad motives, Philippians 1. So I'm sure he felt great and was very respectful and on great terms with those who had pure motives, like the original apostles.
Yeah, Megan?
Yeah, so you said one of the hot topic issues for the first century church was circumcision.
That was the number 1 issue, not just one. It was the issue.
Cool. So what would you say is the number 1 issue amongst Christianity today?
Today, because every century has an issue. The 2nd century was Gnosticism. Celibacy and clericalism by the 3rd century, politics by the 4th century. Today, what are the issues? Well, I would say it's the erosion of truth and belief in truth.
Talk about that for a second.
The impact of... What's that?
Expound on that.
I mean, postmodernism. I was reading a book today by a brother I deeply respect. He doesn't live in Atlanta. Don't try to guess who he is. But he was using these postmodern phrases like, well, that was my truth, and I didn't understand what was her truth, what was her reality. Now, wait a minute. Reality and truth are... You mean his perception of reality. But his perception of reality isn't true if it doesn't actually correspond to reality. So this kind of confusion is not just confusion about morals, what's sin, what's right, what's wrong. It's confusion about pretty much everything. History, literature, science, mathematics, but it's especially seen in philosophy and religion. So I think that's a big one today. That's why we need more people to study Christian evidences and to write books and to debate agnostics. And I'm wondering if you'll be willing to do that. Someone needs to do it. I'm having lunch later in the week with a friend of mine who does a lot of debates and writing and has quite an impact. But I would love to hear some of you guys doing that very thing. Debating the sheikhs or the rabbis or the atheists. Writing books, articles, maybe it's podcasts. Hey, do your podcast for me. I'll pay you $50. That's how I do it. So,
Yeah, Chase.
This is a
question, so feel free to write me off here.
Specific question may end up in a very specific and short reply.
That's fair. So in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul
Yes.
references the thorn in his flesh.
The thorn in the flesh.
Is there any inclination as to what that actually was or why it would be significant?
No, Paul doesn't tell us, just as earlier in the chapter, he doesn't tell us what he actually experienced in paradise. So people have tried to guess. And I tell you here, maybe the most often, is that when he was stoned and nearly killed, back in Acts 14, it affected his eyes. He says to the Galatians, what happened to your joy? You were doing so well. You would have, I came to you because of an illness. You would have ripped out your eyes and given them to me, which implies he had eye problems. Unless that's just a common phrase, like, we're so close, man, I'd rip out my eyes for you. But I'm not aware of that. So, maybe the thorn of the flesh had to do with vision. Or that when he was stoned, brain damage, and he had some kind of epilepsy. What I don't buy is it was a moral thing. They say like he was repressing sexual urges or something. I'm not even sure you would call that a thorn in the flesh. But it's something that apparently was painful, as thorns are. And Paul prays 3 times for God to take it away. And then concludes, it must be the Lord's will that I live with this. And he does it. He never mentions it again. Totally unlike me. I hurt myself. We'll be hearing about it periodically.
Yeah, Gabe.
This is extremely random. So,
Really random?
extremely, like, stupid. What is Satan?
What is Satan?
Yeah, it's random.
Satan is a fallen angel, created good, but went the wrong way. There isn't that much on Satan in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, but even in the New. Not a lot.
So Satan like a single being?
Yeah, but he seems to be a networker. See, what I don't buy is that Satan has all knowledge. I don't think he's equally wide. You know, he's not all-knowing. He's not almighty. It's not like God and Satan. If they wrestled, it would be a draw. Satan would be pinned in a microsecond. You know, and he's not. Here's one more thing for you to think about. I don't think Satan can be everywhere at the same time. So if he's tempting me tomorrow morning, you know, at 8 o'clock, then he's probably not directly tempting you at 8 o'clock. Unless he actually is everywhere at the same time. But if he has minions, that's the network I refer to, then yeah, you can all be messed up at the same time. But don't think of him as like the total opposite of God, equally powerful, but like God is +1 and Satan is -1. It's not like that. Satan is more like God's 1 and Satan is -0.0001. That was random. You just randomly put up your hand again? How random? Okay, let's go to the next question. Actually, is there a woman who's got a question? Because it's all, oh yes, I see 2 women now.
Amanda.
No, women, got it. I'm kind of scared. But did Paul baptize people?
Did Paul baptize people?
So, like, if he did, like, do you know around how many people, like, approximately?
Even Paul doesn't know how many he baptized. When he writes 1 Corinthians, and this is a few years after he's established the church there, actually not that long at all, he says, oh, I baptized this guy, and that guy. Oh yeah, and that household. Other than that, I don't remember. He actually didn't remember. And his point is that the gospel is not about how many people you baptize or circumcise, like you're keeping track, you're keeping notches. It's about Christ crucified. It's not counting the baptisms. Not that baptisms are incredibly important. But Paul seems to be putting less emphasis on baptism. But he's simply trying to get people not to be sectarian. I was baptized by him. Oh, really? Man, I was baptized by that guy. I wish I'd had a better baptism. Like I had a more prestigious baptism. He says, no, the power's to God. It's not to us. I'm going to remember. He wasn't keeping track. So you don't need to keep track. Another woman, and now I see 3 more.
So when I read the Bible, I tend to have like a hard time on what I should focus on, whether it's like the history or like how it applies to my life or just the story in general.
Okay.
So when you were saying like get to know every chapter in the New Testament, what
Sure.
would you focus on the most to be the most efficient, I guess.
Well, see, this actually has a lot more pages than the old version. So we go to the appendix, the 10 Bible reading tips. That could be very useful for you. And that's right after the appendix about reading a whole Bible in a year. So rather than give you a bunch of tips right now, it's right here, or you can find this on my website. Go to my website, type in the word 52, 52. You'll get 52 tips right there. Okay? You need training. If someone told you, hey, it's God's word, just open your heart and pray, you'll understand it. That person meant well, but was misleading you. A lot of it's not easy to understand without training. The apostles needed training. Paul had training. Early Christians they valued highly the words of God. These days, sadly, Bible study has to compete with all of our video games and everything else. And it ends up becoming a very low priority for most Christians. But not for you.
Yasmin?
So, when Paul had his encounter with Jesus, and then he was blind, and then he went to go study and learn before he went out to, do his missions, etc. In that moment when he was learning, I might be wrong, but the Gospels were written like 30 to 40 years at least after the death and resurrection and everything. And so, I feel like he preached so much about Jesus that he couldn't have just been learning the Old Testament. And so, how is it that he was learning so much about Jesus' message?
Okay, it's like several questions folded into one. You're right, the Gospels are written later. Paul preaches immediately, and then finally, he's so controversial that the brothers send him away. He leaves Judea, and then the churches in Judea had a time of peace. It's a funny verse, Acts 9:31, because Paul's not there. So Paul has this time in Arabia. The first gospel, most scholars say is Mark, and they put Mark in the 60s, maybe the 50s. But it's still a couple decades later. Now, the fact that the Gospels are written down later doesn't mean that the gospel, was like in flux. The message was the same. One of the oldest parts of the New Testament, one of the oldest sources of the New Testament is actually 1 Corinthians 15, the very beginning. You know what I'm referring to?
1 Corinthians what?
Like 15:1 and 2, he talks about the gospel that they've received, of which they've taken a stand. And then he explains what it is for. This is what I preached as a first report, that Christ died according to the Scriptures, he was buried, raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to all these different people. So that source material, which seems to go back to the very beginning, either to Damascus Road or to Paul going to Jerusalem and confirming it with Peter, John, and Jesus' brother, that source material is at most a year or two after the crucifixion, and quite likely only months after. So the gospel is full-blown from the beginning. Now, how it's appreciated, how it's expressed, that develops in time. But the critics are wrong who say that Jesus was promoted into a God by the end of the first century. He was God at the very beginning. Just the way people appreciated him, that changed. So even though he didn't have written gospels, there were still accounts, and there were eyewitnesses to talk to. But apparently, Jesus spoke to him directly a few times, which is amazing.
Kitty.
Oh,
I think I was considering your pretty thorough study of the Bible in general, but especially Paul's life. And I think my question was kind of in all your study, what were the things that inspired you the most about Paul's life?
what inspires me the most about Paul's life? I think the way he used his training, he made the most of it. He tried to relate to as many different people as possible in the course of his travels. And so for me, I feel like I'm really spoiled because I get the chance to go where Paul preached. I get to talk to the scholars, I get to read the history books, and I just realized how hard Paul worked to take advantage of the training he'd had, the networks of relationships he was building, of different people, understanding cultures. He tried. I'm not saying the other apostles didn't. We know the other apostles went out to different countries, but Paul was kind of a man for every country. And to me, that's inspiring. And that even if no one was monitoring him, he was still evangelistic. Like especially when he goes to Athens, all alone. First time I ever went to Athens, I was all alone. And I had a week to go around the city and look at things and share my faith. And I just thought of Paul being there, with no one there to, like he wasn't doing it to be a good example. I don't think he knew it would end up in Acts 17. But he just did it because that's what Christians do. We share Jesus. And Paul is that kind of a guy. Hard-driven, hard worker. I love a guy like that.
Let's take a few more. So we're going to go Harrison. I also have a question.
What do you think Paul's mindset was when he talked about how people preached Christ even in envy and strife? And
In Philippians 1.
yes, and how should we have that mindset today?
So what was Paul's mindset, you said? Or
Right, because I think I can have a mindset of it being if Christ is being preached in a bad way, then that can be a negative thing.
Right, because we say, well, that guy did a great sermon, or it was a great book, too bad he wasn't a member of our church. Which is probably not the way to think about it. Philippians says, as he talks about these in 1:15, it's true, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, the former out of selfish ambition, but not sincerely. But what does it matter? The important thing is that, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. Because of this I rejoice. So I think the way we should view is that anytime any effort makes Christ better understood, whoever's doing it, we should rejoice. That knowledge of Christ is not going to hurt people. But it came from a guy who belonged to that group. So what? I mean, we read books from every possible group, almost, don't we? I mean, you could learn from anybody. So, of course, you may think a guy has wrong motives, and maybe he doesn't. But Paul was talking specifically about people who are trying to get him in trouble. They're hoping Paul would be arrested, and Paul was familiar with that type of person. So it's not Paul being paranoid, because Paul was actually in prison right at that time because of people like that. So that would be my response. We should have a positive attitude when Christ is preached. Though sometimes we need to intervene and share a bit more. Like one of my neighbors is extremely evangelistic, really evangelistic. So I've been spending a lot of time with him. And he said, I was going to lead a study on baptism, but I wanted to wait and see what you thought about that first. Do you have any ideas? Well, I didn't. I dropped the whole, empty the whole, drop all the bombs on him. But we had a very good talk. He said this was really helpful, and we'll get back to it later. So I kind of think of the sensitivity that Aquila and Priscilla had with someone like Apollos. We've got to be better, less adversarial, more respectful. Because what if God says, right before the last day, I'm really going to be looking at your heart and how much you preach Christ and how you really lived your normal life. Not so much how often did you have quiet times or did you skip Tuesday or Friday or whatever. And if he said that, for some of us, that would be very worrying. I thought if I just did this, I'd be okay. What if God did that? He said, I know what I said, but there are a lot of people who are doing a lot more than you were, and we may smile upon them. Romans 2:26. So think about that. Or don't.
I pick myself.
Graham picks himself.
Yes.
Did you baptize yourself? Did you raise yourself up in leadership? See?
Now I have the power. So my question is, we talked about this a little bit on Saturday in the class you taught, but how do you help people who uphold Paul and some of his teachings over and against Jesus, even when the way they're talking about Paul conflicts with the gospel of Jesus?
You're talking about people who elevate Paul over Jesus, not Jesus over Paul.
Right, exactly. Even if Jesus says something and then the way they explain Paul doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I know you're alluding to Martin Luther. May he rest in peace.
Mark Calvin.
He's been dead for a long time. Or Calvin. Okay. So Luther one of the architects, or certainly fathers of the Reformation. That means to whatever extent you and I are Protestant, we've been affected by Luther. Luther had several views. One is that while the Gospels are good, especially John, because he thought the other three weren't really worthwhile, to really understand Jesus, you need to read Paul, especially Romans. So John was privileged over the other three Gospels, and Paul was privileged over Jesus, but especially Romans. Because in Romans you get the full Gospel. I'm not actually sure you do, but that's what Luther thought. What else did he do? So that explains our we love to look at verses from Paul. The problem is, Protestants will say, see, it's just grace, it's just faith, and that conflicts with Jesus. And Jesus says, no, you actually need to visit the sick. And you can't just say, well, I did an exorcism where I preached you. You have to actually build your life on my word, which sounds like works, because it is works. So Luther was overreacting to the church of the Middle Ages. What else he did? He said that James, the letter of James, is rubbish, it's straw. I mean, if you're having a fire, you can throw it in there, it'll be good combustible, no burning material. Doesn't deserve to be in the Bible. Why? Because one of Luther's big mantras was that we're saved by faith alone. Now that phrase, faith alone, doesn't appear in the Bible except in one place, in James, where it says we're not justified by faith alone. Luther said, who says James is inspired? Who says Hebrews is inspired? Because 12 times Hebrews says you could fall away and lose your salvation. So Luther said Hebrews should not be in the New Testament. Neither should Jude. Apparently because it quotes from 1 Enoch. And then neither should Revelation be, because no one can understand it. But I think he was giving up too soon on that. So, I mean, I noticed this because when I read Luther's Bible, his New Testament, I read like the original Luther's Bible, I noticed that it only had 23 books instead of 27. The other 4 were put into an appendix. Translated under protest almost.
We'll wrap up with Cody.
Have I answered the question okay?
That was great. Exactly what I wanted.
It is, so you were guiding me, and you should have just said it. If you knew what I was going to say. But we're all affected.
I wanted more than what you gave on Saturday.
Oh, yeah. I give you a little bit more.
Thank you.
I want to know about Paul's lifestyle, and because a lot of times I can feel like he was just in the marketplace or in the synagogue just preaching all day long, and that makes me feel super overwhelmed with my lifestyle.
You would feel overwhelmed to be preaching all day long?
Yes.
What, you don't love the Lord? Look at, in tomorrow's newsletter, you'll see a link to something my friend Jim McGuigan said. Click on that link, and you'll see that I certainly don't mean what I was just joking about. Go ahead. What was his lifestyle?
Yeah, what was Paul's life like? What can we tell that his life looked like?
You mean like a normal day in the life of Paul?
Yes.
Probably wasn't that normal. You know, because he's in a place for a few weeks or months or years, and then he moves, and then he keeps going to prison everywhere. So it's a little, Holy Spirit warns me that imprisonment awaits me wherever I go. So we don't really know. We know a lot more about Muhammad's lifestyle. How he ate, how he washed, how he prayed. We know detail we don't even need to know. What about Jesus and Paul? That kind of stuff we don't know. We know what they stood for. So I could just mention a couple things. One is, as a minister of the gospel, he did not live high on the hog. Now, the false teachers in the 1st and 2nd centuries, they did. They thought, if I'm God's man, I should have really nice clothes and be very impressive to others. Total opposite of the apostles. The apostles were the scum of the earth. Paul's phrase. You'd say, well, didn't the church take care of him? Well, let's just say when it didn't, he just went back to his trade. He was a leather worker, a tent maker. And normally, even if the church supported him, it wasn't much more than room and board and transport to the next city. So some churches supported him a lot, others supported him not at all. So sometimes he was working a full-time job, other times he was working part-time, and it just depended. He didn't say you have to. he actually tried to take as little support as possible. That's a little different than modern preachers. What'd you say? What did you say? So he's not materialistic. He lives quite simply. But he was not an ascetic. He was not someone who said, you know, the more I hurt, the more inconvenienced I am, then the more spiritual I am. He says in Philippians 4, I can be content, whether well-fed or not so well-fed, having plenty or having very little. It was not going to change whether he smiled that day, you know, whether he got to eat that day. So he was incredibly flexible. Something that I know we are all flexible to different extents. I hope I'm more flexible now than I used to be. But when you become an old man, you can become a grumpy old man and be very inflexible, like Granddad, you know, who has to be done his way. Paul, I see someone aging who is just more and more flexible. And maybe that's one reason he continued to reach out. He never retired. He went out in a blaze of glory, even though in prison.
All right, guys, let's give it up for Doug here.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thanks for coming. I think Doug presented a lot of information, and for some of us that might be one of the first times we've had such dense historical teaching from the scriptures. But don't let it overwhelm you. I think if you take away anything, it's, man, Paul lived a life that was radically devoted to Jesus.
Yeah.
He did whatever he could for Jesus. And if you consider yourself a serious student of Jesus, then I would take Doug's challenge seriously to memorize and learn what every chapter of the New Testament is about. Not that you need to know every word, but just the idea behind every chapter. And that will help you even in your own walk with God. And so before we're dismissed, actually we're going to have a baptism tonight. Speaking about baptism. And so a dear friend of ours, Betty, is getting baptized at our church. And so if you want to go check that out, we're probably going to get out of here really quick and head down there. Hopefully get it started by around 9:30. But if you want to know where it is, it's called North River, but just ask somebody for the address. Or if you're lucky, Google it. Sometimes it takes you to Florida, though, so be careful. But anyway, I'm going to say a quick prayer, and then we're going to be dismissed. God, we love you. Help us to imitate Paul as he imitates you, Jesus. Help us to use his writings, his teachings, his lifestyle, and his example to become more and more like the image of your Son. We love you, God. Thank you for blessings like the Bible, like Paul, who has an amazing example for our lives, and for